Last night I offered you a brief biography of a lifetime friend. And although I thought it would be safely inferred as to what my purpose was, I want to make that explicit. The Vietnam War has never been an abstraction to me. It has been a highly personal matter. So important is the Vietnam War that I never wanted it to be turned over to those who wish to use it for some political purpose or to advance some political agenda, whether it be on the left of the spectrum or the right of the spectrum. Indeed, the Vietnam War has invited a kind of polemical scholarship that stands as the bane of serious-minded historians. Not only is there a great deal of writing on the Vietnam War that one has to just wade through, but as one might expect, in a matter of time, Hollywood got into the act. And Hollywood is best understood, and I'm not a person of strong opinions, best understood as a purveyor of nonsense. And we have had a lot of nonsense purveyed. What I'd like to do, at least how I see the charge that Rob gave to me today, is to sketch out what I consider to be the 10 most important questions that we're going to wrestle with this week. The 10 questions that will give us armor, a defense against the polemicists and those whose ulterior motive is to promote a political agenda. Historians generally are not viewed kindly by people who prefer bumper stickers and sloganeering and complexity simplified. But it is a complex subject. So the 10 central questions I'm going to sketch today amount to how I think we ought to think about the Vietnam War. And I do not, and I know George does not, speak ex cathedra on these matters. The highest priority, I think, this week is your curiosity and your questions and your readiness to cross-examine our 30 years of experience, our 30 years of researching, our 30 years of fielding questions from students in the classroom. Where do we begin? We begin in the most improbable places with Otto von Bismarck. And you can rightly scratch your head. What in the hell is Otto von Bismarck doing? The master of 19th century German statecraft is supposed to have said that fools learn from their own experience while wise men learn from the experience of others. It's a good rule of thumb. It's a good yardstick to measure architects of our foreign policy back then and today. Accordingly, the first key question around which this week's presentations will be developed is, what did the French war with the Viet Minh teach American policymakers? The Americans have this weakness, this Achilles heel. They think history began yesterday or maybe this morning when you got up. That they cut in on a historical process thousands of years long and assume away that antecedents have any relevance. By the way, it's a blessing too, as it is a curse, that complexity again. Because without that attitude, all the virtue that comes from a can-do mentality gets undercut. See, history is a great encumbrance. It's also a great illuminator. And it takes human beings to figure out when it's illuminating and when it's encumbering. Secondly, what were the major strategies and tactics adopted by America's civilian and military leaders in their own war with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and were those decisions wise in the light of history? We can't begin when the first American advisors arrive in Southeast Asia. An important collateral and controversial aspect is, what was the role and the impact of air power? And I just provide you with a single quote for you to mull over and to chew on and to keep in mind. At the outset of the Americanization of the Vietnam War, as we escalated our combat role, General Curtis LeMay claimed, quote, "Air power could win the war without the introduction of Army troops or Marines into South Vietnam. It was, by the way, a view advanced by the proponents of air power on the eve of World War II. And we must, throughout this course, factor in the power, like an extraordinary magnet, that air power as a decisive instrument of war has had for the American people. It pulls us. It inclines us to simplify great complexities that come with having to put boots on the ground." George Herring, gratefully, will bring his expertise to bear on all of these important matters. Thirdly, since the Vietnam War was the first televised war, it seems reasonable to ask, and we have, how was the war reported? And did the media coverage reshape public opinion to the benefit of the anti-war movement? Can the press, this is a cluster question, can the press be regarded as a decisive factor in the war's outcome? By the way, does anybody have any idea how many journalists were in Vietnam covering the war at the peak of press coverage? Anybody?
600-700.
600 or 700.
200.
Do I have a higher or lower figure? 200. It's seemingly an innocuous question, but it's pregnant with significance. 5,000. 1,000 journalists were covering the war. 1,000 journalists. Do you really think they spoke with one voice? Doesn't this suggest a difficulty about the press as a useful analytical concept? Are there limitations when we talk about the press? Ought we not to use the concept cautiously and carefully? But if your purpose is to use words as if they don't have descriptive power, but that they have emotive power, that is, say, use words like they're flags, you run them up to stir up emotions, then maybe we aren't faithful to the historical record. Ask yourself, as we get prepared for a discussion on the role of the media, how useful is this concept, the press, the media, when you have 1,000 different journalists covering that war, all the way from Henry Luce's Time Life to what the military like to call the communist broadcasting system, CBS, or the Washington Post, which was belittled as the Pravda on the Potomac. So you have a whole range of journalists coming at it with different political axes to grind, and some of them generally objective. Stanley Carno, who wrote an extraordinarily good book, a journalist cum historian, who had extensive first-hand experience in Southeast Asia, has written that, quote, "The press was behind the public." This obviously contradicts conventional wisdom. The press was behind the public, not in front of the public. So we will consider at some point, I hope, the question is, has the power of the press been greatly exaggerated? On this subject, Bob DiMaria will shed light on Wednesday. Fourthly, Ted Delaney will address the issue of how the selective service system functioned during the war and what its consequences were. Last night, I mentioned just 2 consequences, but there are vastly more. About this, I have a little to say by way of editorializing this morning. A 5th question, one that I will consider on Wednesday, is how did their backgrounds and personalities and sense of history shape LBJ's and Richard Nixon's conduct of the war? I look forward to that. In light of Hanoi's official tally of 1 million military dead and 2 million civilians killed, these are debatable figures, but those are the official ones, along with 600,000 military wounded, we will also explore, as we must, the experiences of the Vietnamese themselves, both America's allies and its enemies, during as well as after the fighting. Is there, I wonder, truth in the observation that the French and the Americans destroyed Vietnam in order to save it, while the victorious communist government in Hanoi saved the country in order to destroy it for the next 2 decades? It is one of those ironies, sublime of sort, that characterized the Vietnam War. We are fortunate to have Truong Ngoc Dang with us to discuss this subject. We're extraordinarily grateful that he has traveled from Hanoi. A closely related question that I will explore tomorrow is, who was that man Ho Chi Minh? Or as it is pronounced in some parts of Vietnam, as I discovered, Ho Chi Minh, America's principal nemesis throughout the war. A 7th question, that American history and popular culture, especially its remarkably potent and enduring myths, mold significantly the public's response to events in Southeast Asia. An 8th topic to be examined by George Herring and Pam Simpson is who comprised the anti-war movement and what was its effect on the war and American culture. David Robarge has come to us from the Central Intelligence Agency to examine the role of intelligence in the war, a matter of vital importance. And finally, what are the legacies and lessons to be drawn from the Vietnam War? That will be the capstone of the week's sustained inquiry. In Bismarck's judgment, in other words, have recent architects of American foreign policy been fools or wise men? Have they learned from their own experience, or have they learned from the experience of others? Did they study the Vietnam War and distill its essence? Or did they become selectively amnesiacs and choose only to study that which they thought was worthy of study? George Herring and I will tackle that assignment in our wrap-up session on Friday. These are the roughly 10 central questions that our speakers will be covering. Our plate, in other words, is going to be full. No one's going to skimp this week. Your portions will be as large as what you get in Evans Dining Hall. The question I start with today: what did you do in the war, Gramps? What a painful question. The question used to be, what did you do in the war, Dad? And now with 4 grandchildren, I have to deal with horrors. Gramps, what did you do? We know that the word Vietnam is embedded in our national psyche, and you know for all the reasons why. It would be crashing through an open door to itemize those for you. And I know you wouldn't want me to do that. With a little gout in my left foot, I couldn't do it anyway. That shooting war in Asia was the longest and fourth bloodiest. 58,000 American names inscribed on that sacred place in Washington called the Vietnam Memorial, Veterans Memorial. Given the accounting profession that we've been dealing with in the last 10 years, it's no surprise that we don't really know how much we spent. Somewhere between $150 and $200 billion fighting the war. On the home front, there was another war. That war in Southeast Asia set fathers and sons, as well as generations, against each other. Though I must tell you at the outset, I have found in my own research that we have a problem, which is always the challenge. And then we have what, for political or personal or psychological reasons, is morphed into an issue. And what I wish to do today, among other things, is to debunk some myths about what went on at the home front, and then return to the war in Southeast Asia and see if I can debunk a few more. There was a remarkable split going on in America. The families most famously split by the war were the Mcnamaras and the Russ. Can you imagine that the very people at the top prosecuting the war, overseeing its escalation and Americanizing it, had to go home every night and face sons who were dramatically anti-war? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk presided over the escalation, and at home were their anti-war peace activist sons, Craig and Richard. The long-haired, bearded war protester at Stanford, Craig McNamara, had a picture of Ho Chi Minh up on his wall and the American flag upside down in his bedroom. He would drop out of college, become an expatriate, leave the country, and work romantically in the fields of Mexico and Chile. In Mexico, he hooked up with the great pedagogical reformer of the time, Ivan Illich, and worked growing whatever they grew in Illich's fields. The war abroad, and what LBJ belittled as that, quote, damn little pissant country in vintage LBJ jargon, was something that ignited a domestic upheaval. A lot of that protest and unrest had to do with the military draft and the widespread resistance and evasion that it provoked. It opened up a divide in American culture for the next 40 years between Vietnam veterans and those who never did military service during the war. Those who went and those who didn't. And different historians give greater weight or greater emphasis to this divide. My take is that the width of the divide has been a function of one's politics, as is so often the case with trying to come to grips with the Vietnam War. Robert Timberg, for example, a Marine combat veteran who wrote an extraordinarily compelling book called The Nightingale Song that I will make reference to later, gives great play to this divide. To him, it's like the Grand Canyon. It's something that perhaps will never be bridged. And for many combat veterans, according to Timberg, that is how they perceive the rest of the culture. It is a divide that has often been magnified at election time for partisan advantage. And I think it also has been overstated for dramatic effect. I never found in my relationship with Peter Barber that the war in any way, because he fought it and I didn't, skewed or distorted or perverted our relationship. And so I ask those who see that kind of unbridgeable divide, I asked them to consider the evidence which suggests that it might not be as great as they contend. Most young Americans in the 1960s, and of course this is not what the conventional wisdom permits. Most young Americans in the 1960s neither fought the war nor demonstrated against it. This doesn't have the dramatic quality of hawks and doves at each other. Rather than the simplicity of hawks and doves, most Americans of the Vietnam generation were what I would dub, to keep the aviary metaphor going, owls. They simply didn't know. They were puzzled by what was happening. They neither were against nor were they for. They neither rushed to the colors nor volunteered for service. Some did. Some were drafted. But the truly shocking feature of the 1960s is how many Americans of that generation simply didn't get involved. They dated, they played sports, they married, they pursued careers, and most avoided the passions and the turmoil of that decade. And of all the facts about that so-called sick, tumultuous 60s period, is that in 1968 and 1972, a majority of young Americans voted for Richard Nixon. Factor that into this bipolar perception of the 60s, pitting hawks and doves against one another. History is a messy place. You look for this wonderful symmetry the way it ought to be, and then you get poleaxed with reality. Poleaxed. I think George knows of what I say. You turn over enough documents, and after a while, you begin to hate journalists. Sorry, Bob. Sorry, Bob. The war managers in Washington presided over a fundamentally unfair system. A world of deferments and exemptions meant, quite literally, selective service. I don't think that's what General Lewis Hershey had in mind. Selective service. The system heavily favored the upper middle class and the college-educated that it produced. People who had fathers who were doctors and lawyers, who understood how to navigate a system that those who had factory workers for a father could barely comprehend. As Christian Appy has so aptly described the war, it was a poor man's war. And after early disproportionate losses by African Americans who were killed in action disproportionately to their numbers in the population, which sent LBJ through the roof, the numbers of African Americans who were killed subsided dramatically, and those who died, of the 58,000, were disproportionately poor Americans. Class trumped race in this instance. And then, of course, there was Robert McNamara. Is the road to hell not often paved with good intentions? Is not the yellow brick road the road to the humbug? Robert McNamara's Pentagon lowered standards during this time for admission to the military. And by doing so, the Pentagon played into the hands of the college-educated who were eager to pursue loopholes and deferments. Between 1966 and 1971, under the auspices of Project 100,000, the military services were compelled, even the Marine Corps, to get 20% of their recruits from the bottom rung of the test scores. It was felt that this would be a socially leveling instrument. You would move up via the military. You would achieve a social mobility through the military. By the way, these tended to be future infantrymen, and they were largely from poor families. In a sense, the loopholes, when combined with Project 100,000, opened the door to the William Rusty Callies of the war. William Rusty Calley of Miami, Florida, who became an officer despite lacking the mental and moral equipment required of officerhood, who allegedly could not even read a map when he was in Vietnam, became a leader of men after having done the impossible, flunking out of Palm Beach Junior College in his first year. The utterly impossible. In World War II, college graduates were actually overrepresented in combat and the front lines. And one of the challenges of studying the Vietnam War is you constantly have World War II as your reference point. What did they do in the good war? How did we go to war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor? Harvard and West Point during World War II lost a comparable number of graduates. Does that boggle your mind? When one speeds up the reel of history and gets into the Vietnam War? Harvard and West Point lost comparable numbers of graduates. The Harvard classes of 1941, 1942, and 1946 each lost twice as many men as Harvard did in the entire Vietnam War, which was 19. The poster boy of elite sacrifice, of course, was George Bush Sr., a graduate of Phillips Andover Academy, later to be a Yale graduate, class of 1948, who left prep school despite his family's long-tailedness and pedigree, and became the youngest combat pilot in the U.S. Navy. One could not say the same of his son. Of the 11 million Americans who joined the armed forces during the Vietnam War years as either volunteers or draftees, approximately 2.5 million did military service in Vietnam. This is why I alluded last night to the possibility that there are 2.5 million experiences that need to be reckoned with. That was less than 25% of all servicemen and less than 10% of the draft age population. The great majority of Americans, the 16 million out of those 27 million, or 60%, who came of draft age, that is between the ages of 19 and 26, between 1964 and 1973, saw no military service. No military service whatsoever. They neither rushed to the colors, enlisted, were conscripted, nor burned their draft cards. There were many, however, in that generation who gamed the system. One, future President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And I would like to say a few words, if you permit me, about Slick Willie. Bill Clinton epitomized his generation. He was part of the mainstream experience, in which only 10% of the draft age population served in Vietnam. I'll get into how many actually saw combat. The number was so minuscule that we salute those who bore such a disproportionate burden for the rest of us. If you think the burden is heavily borne in Iraq today, what went on in Vietnam, I think, causes what goes on today to pale. Bill Clinton dissembled for a while, never telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But this is the truth, I think, about President Clinton and Nam. He actually received his draft notice in April 1969, when he was in his first year at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. And just like Dan Quayle, I'll have more to say about the pro-war people. But just like Dan Quayle, Bill searched around for a place in the National Guard and the Army Reserve, because as everybody knew at the time, though, by the way, as time goes by, memory dulls, and it's easy to rationalize and say other things, but everybody knew who lived through the 1960s that given that LBJ wanted to keep a low profile in the war, and that LBJ didn't want to jeopardize his domestic reform program, the Great Society, he would not activate the National Guard or the Army Reserve, except in some small, rare exceptions. But in those days, it was understood that if you could get into the National Guard or the Army Reserve, it was a reprieve from Vietnam. Unlike Quayle, Clinton failed throughout the summer of '69. So Clinton promised to join ROTC at the University of Arkansas after completing his second year at Oxford. This was a contract that he signed with the professor of military science at the University of Arkansas. And then President Clinton changed his mind. And he did send a letter saying, I will not join ROTC. But he was saved from induction rather fortuitously with the introduction of the lottery system in late 1969, which was announced in November and went into effect on December 1st, 1969. And it is true that between the summer of '69, when he announced he was not going to join ROTC, and the lottery, he was vulnerable to being inducted. And he wasn't. On December 1st, 1969, he drew the number 311. I know about these high numbers. I got 365. It was high enough to give him a pass on Vietnam. But Bill Clinton, as much static as he has received on his run-up to the presidency, was no lone wolf. And what equally boggles the mind is how many politicians who were for the Vietnam War and who claimed that it was unwinnable and that the politicians were to blame for the Vietnam War's failure, also found loopholes through which they could escape the war. To wit, Dan Quayle, who went into the National Guard. David Stockman, who used that last resort of last resorts, who used divinity school, which was the last exemption available to people. He had no intention of becoming a minister. But he would then become head of the Office of Management Budget in the Reagan years. Phil Graham. Phil, where were you? Where were you, Gramps, in the Vietnam War? He received a string of deferments as a professor of economics at Texas A&M and felt that that was the equal of an MOS 11B, 11 Bush infantry lineman in Quang Tri province in Vietnam. Dick Cheney, who flits across the pages of David Moranis' book, if you've read it closely, They March to the Sunlight. Visualize him. Head down, walking across the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus with his IBM punch cards, trying to find out what is to be discovered from all those holes. Indifferent to the war and indifferent to the war protesters. Where were you, Gramps, Dick, during the Vietnam War? Newt Gingrich, where were you, Gramps, during the Vietnam War? It goes on and on. And all it does to me is to bring me back to the biblical injunction. Let he who would be without sin cast the first stone. Why are we a culture so saturated in hypocrisy? Why do the very people who are guilty of what they charge others to be hurl all of these charges and allegations? Oh yes, this week we will be looking in the mirror. And the reflection that we see may not always be very pretty. One important fact about the Vietnam War should be established at the outset of any week-long discussion. Unlike World War II, sacrifice was anything but universal. and it is a source of shame and remains a source of shame. My hero in the 20th century, though not shared by many of the students I once taught at VMI, my hero is George C. Marshall. And at the end of World War II, George C. Marshall offered a piece of extraordinary wisdom. He said, in a democratic society, the only way to handle the shield of the republic was universal military training. That way, we are fair. We are even-handed. Nobody in Congress wanted to go along with the prophet scorned in the late 1940s. It is still the only just system, it seems to me, in a democracy. Unlike World War II, when 70% of draft-age men were in uniform, the vast majority, in other words, the typical draft-age American did not serve in the military during the Vietnam War, let alone in Vietnam itself. Unlike World War II, except for segregated African Americans, Vietnam was not a culturally unifying war. It did fracture us. It did rend our social fabric. It did undermine the social contract. It did make a mockery of Montesquieu and Locke. Unlike World War II, America's elite left the fighting and dying to their less privileged countrymen. And there are exceptions, of course, many exceptions. As I told you, my friend Peter doesn't fit the profile. He's the statistical anomaly. College graduate with an advanced degree who ends up an enlisted man fighting in Quang Tri province. But there were enough of them to command our respect. In 1969, draftees accounted for 88% of infantry riflemen in Vietnam. Indeed, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was generally understood that lifers were in the rear and draftees were in the front. And that, of course, is not what you would call leadership by example. Another crisis in the American military. So in one striking way, the Vietnam veterans' experience was certainly exceptional. It was exceptional. It was exceptional in other ways as well. In 1968, American troop strength peaked. If I can get that up there. It peaked, well, give or take 5,000 or 6,000. It peaked at about 550,000 men. They were overwhelmingly young men. Their average age between 19 and 20, which contrasted markedly with the average age of 26 in World War II. World War II was fought by a more mature American. So for 26, you had to have a lot of people in their late 20s too, because you also had a lot of Marines who were enlisting at 17. The military they fought in had also changed in other equally dramatic ways. For example, given the U.S. Army's huge tail-to-tooth ratio, an important feature of the war, which most people seem oblivious to, the tooth-to-tail ratio, the fighting spearhead against the big buttocks that's going to give support and provide maintenance to the warriors who are doing the fighting. That tail-to-tooth ratio is conservatively given at 8-to-1. There are some who put it at 10 and 12-to-1. And of course, all of these figures go out the window during Tet, because at that time, when the enemy brought the war right into the base camps, just about everybody, the cooks, the people running the bowling alleys, they all got an M16 and participated in the combat. But barring that dramatic exception, the number of combat troops in 1967 and 1968 never exceeded 15% of all American troops in Vietnam. This was not a lean, mean fighting machine. At most, 80,000 of the 550,000 were actually fighting the war. For each grunt in a line company or boonie rat in a maneuver battalion who was outside the concertina wire, or a helicopter pilot, or a member of a medevac unit, there were 8 Remington Raiders in the rear. And this is not a term of endearment. We're in an age of computers. Remingtons were the typewriters of choice among the clerks. And those who fought the war spoke pejoratively about the Remington Raiders. The magnitude of the tale is best captured by Long Binh. Who knows about Long Binh? Anybody been to Long Binh? Yeah. You've been to Long Binh. Well, let me take you back in time, Mike. Here's Long Binh up in the corner. What's important about Long Binh? Well, it was the biggest U.S. military base in the world. Long Binh. Just outside of Saigon, north of Saigon. A supply base outside of Saigon. It was more than a supply base. I'll get into all of its facets in a minute. This phenomenon at Long Binh could also be appreciated at Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, Dong Tam in the Mekong Delta, or at any divisional headquarters. During the war, Long Binh, the rear support complex that it was, housed 30,000 soldiers and civilian contractors. They lived in a world of offices, food services, PXs, motor pools, NCO clubs, warehouses, bars, bowling alleys, swimming pools, the most famous stockade in Nam, and some of the 40 ice cream plants that the U.S. Army operated around the country. Okay?
Left out air conditioning.
Thank you. Air conditioning. Air conditioning. Anyway, luxuries were commonplace. Luxuries were commonplace. Some war correspondents, like John Lawrence, calculated that 10 to 15 Americans in uniform were needed to support each infantryman in the field in Vietnam. This is a big but. This is a big tale. The bloated size of the tale had a great deal to do with the Pentagon's commitment to a high standard of living for American servicemen. Once again, the road to hell, paved with good intentions. It was as well a way for Americans to wage what they had considered to be appropriate modern warfare, because they went to war with the heaviest emphasis, on technology and firepower. And many who observed Americans in Vietnam referred to them as firepower freaks. They decided that technology and firepower took precedence over military guile and finesse. And this created one of the war's many paradoxes. A poor man's war in terms of personnel, but a rich man's war in terms of comforts at the base camp, some might say military self-indulgence at the base camp, and in terms of lavish firepower that approached at times profligacy. Mad Minutes, H&I, the amount of firepower that was expended in Vietnam staggers the imagination. What this signified was that the Vietnam experience meant profoundly different things to returning veterans. And I suggested last night just how fragile generalizations can be. That they sometimes simply collapse under careful examination, and sometimes they're just like soap bubbles that go poof when you get too close to them. An unfair draft was matched by an unfair prosecution of the war. A small percentage of servicemen were asked to assume an inordinately heavy burden. And again, I take you back to one of the assigned readings, to David Moranis's unforgettable You Are There account of the Black Lions, a regiment being led by Colonel Terry Allen Jr., that goes off to battle with two of its companies at half strength. Captain Jim George's company and Clark Welch's Delta Company. They're at half strength. They're supposed to have 185 to 200 men. They've got half that complement when they go out to battle. Was this the price of 40 ice cream plants or of college grads gaming the system? By the end of the week, I hope you're able to answer that in a compelling way. Seldom have so few sacrificed so much for so many. In 1967 and 1969, the chances of an infantry rifleman in a line unit with an MOS of 11B, 11 Bush, or its Marine equivalent, the chance of that person being killed or wounded was 50-50, or even. This was what Sherman called war. It was hell for those people. If you were in the Anhua Valley, where Jim Webb was leading a Marine platoon, it was ceaseless combat with the North Vietnamese. If you were at Khe Sanh, it was constant bombardment from the North Vietnamese. If you were in the Ia Drang in October of 1965 with Colonel Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, who have done us an enormous service by writing the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and have followed it up with We Are Soldiers Still, but not young. If you were in the Ia Drang, or Ia Drang, it was something one never wanted to talk about again. In Saigon, Da Nang, and its elaborate network of rear base camps scattered across the country, the U.S. military had its own world of selective service, its own world of deferments, its own world of exemptions. For historians, what did you do in Vietnam remains a valid question, as valid a question as what did you do during the Vietnam War. That's why when people tell me they went to Vietnam, I'm not much impressed. I want to hear, what was your MOS LB, 11B? What were you doing in the war? Don't try to pull wool over my eyes. Likewise, there were very different wars at very different times that were fought in the war zone of Vietnam. It mattered a great deal if you were there in 65, 64, than if you were there in 69, 70, and 71. It mattered a great deal whether you were in the Mekong, which was a very generally peaceful place compared to, say, I Corps, Quang Tri, An Hoa. So why, oh why, did we fail? I've got 5 minutes to do that justice. And since this is a question we'll all be wrestling with for the rest of the week, I'll only touch it a glancing blow. There, to this day, is no consensus among historians about why we failed. If you thought that the case, Virginia, there is no Santa Claus either. A debate persists to this day. And this is not surprising, since history is really an argument without end. You don't like that? History's messy. We don't have the satisfaction that the scientists have of repeating an experiment in a laboratory and getting it right. There are irreconcilable versions of the past that still contend for followers. There are historians who regard the war as unwinnable. Stanley Carnot, George Herring, among others. There are historians who believe the war was winnable, and that, for example, a recent book by Mark Moyar, Triumph Forsaken, which Cambridge University Press published in 2006, basically says that Ziem and Westmoreland were heroes, Halberstam and Sheehan were villains, Strategic Hamlets was an inspired operation. So the battle among historians continues. It's a disagreement that has extraordinary taproots in our culture, where we cannot come to consensus on it. It began probably with Colonel Harry Summers, who insisted we never lost to the enemy on the battlefield. Well, that would be a surprise to the enemy. And certainly at the platoon, squad, and company level, he must re-examine that position. So as we come to the end, and I will later do a more careful autopsy on Hollywood, or maybe I could do it in the question and answer period, I must shave a few minutes off because we have our picture horrors today. And I want to end with a suggestion. And it's a suggestion that comes from the most unlikely source. At this very outset of our alumni college, as we dig more deeply into the subject of Vietnam, and we do so, I hope, with a fair-mindedness and without polemic, I'm reminded of the wit and wisdom of Charlie Chan, who once lectured number one son that, quote, "Mind like parachute, in order to function, must be open. Keep your parachutes open."